Now that we've got sort of the basics of the interface, we've gone over those. Now let's go over a little bit more about how to get deeper into these controls and how to control geometry in our scene. So I've got a new scene here, just starting with File, New, and then I'm selecting the build layout so that you should be in the same sort of layout as me if you follow those instructions. So let's talk about selecting and manipulating geometry. We kind of did a little bit of this in the previous examples building up to this, but I think at this point it's worth talking about a little bit deeper. And some of these features we'll cover in even more depth in the modeling section, but for now, let's just talk about some of these tools over here on the left-hand side. So before I get started with that, I'm just going to hop over here and hit the tab key to pull up my tab menu, and then I'm going to drop down and test geometry. And this time I'm going to choose the rubber toy. I'm just hitting the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to select rubber toy and hit enter. And then I'm going to hit enter again, and it's going to pop the rubber toy geometry down at the origin. So the first thing here is let's go on to selection. So we did this earlier, but just as a refresher, hitting the S key will bring us to our selection tool. We can select our geometry. Again, also there's this manipulator tool, which generally is a context sensitive. Depending on which node you have selected, it'll give you sort of the functions of that node. I can access that by hitting enter. And you can, if you hover over, you can also get a little tooltip here to give you kind of a clue as to what the hotkey would be to bring that up. But we have our manipulator here, and from here we get our axis handles. So this this circle around here allows us to rotate with orientation according to the camera, or we could rotate around the X around this green one will go around the Y, or this blue one around the Z axis, and you can see it updating our rotation information over here. We also have these knots, which are like free rotation, and then we have our axes, which are Y axis translation, X, and then Z, and then we've got these squares, which will handle our let's see, this would be the ZX plane, and the YX plane, and the ZY plane. Yeah, there you go. So those just allow for like sort of 2D manipulation. You should be familiar with that from some other 3D software, but if you're not, that's that. So cool. Now that we've got, that's the basics of how to transform something at the object level. And it's going to be a little bit different when we dive inside here and mess around with geometry in the SOPs level, or the geometry context. But at the object, in the object context, that's kind of that's one of the ways that you can do it up here. So other kind of things that are sort of common to a 3D workflow is you may want to align your axes to, you might want to align your pivot or move your pivot around in your scene. So you can see here we've actually got a pivot, translate, and rotate for our pivot that we can manually adjust here, and you can see it's making our geometry go in all sorts of crazy directions because our geometry is not centered and we're modifying its pivot, which will cause some strange behavior. So just to make this a little bit easier to illustrate, I'm going to undo this, and I'm going to let's see if I can right click here, and I'm going to say revert my translate to default, and it looks like based off of that, there's also a hotkey for it. So for my rotate, to reset my rotation, I'm just going to control and middle mouse button it, as well as my pivot translate. I'll control and middle mouse button that. So yes, if I wanted to move my pivot off to the right hand side, I could just use my ladder by holding down the middle mouse key and drag it off to the side, and then any rotations I do would be about that new pivot that I had created. If I undo that, now if I wanted to manually interact with where the pivot was and align it by eye, for example, I'm just gonna, suppose I want to add, put the pivot at the tip of his nose here. I'll just hit space bar I'll hit spacebar 4 to bring me into my side view here. And then I'll just hit the, you don't necessarily have to be in this view to move your manipulator, but I'm just doing it because I want to work along his profile. So from here, what I'll do is I'll hit the insert key, and that changes my pivot mode to look a little bit more. If you see, look, if I hit insert, this is the mode we were in before. This is our normal manipulator mode. But if I hit insert one more time, it allows me to move the I'm going to just grab this plane handle, and I can just move my pivot to wherever I want. And it's not actually moving the geometry, it's just adjusting this pivot translation up here in our parameter view. So if I did want to rotate him about his nose, I wouldn't be able to do it yet. See, it's just actually rotating that pivot. But if I hit insert one more time, we're back in our other handle mode, and I can actually rotate him around his nose. Just going to hit spacebar 1 to get back into our normal perspective view. And you can see, yeah, we've appropriately moved the pivot in the way that we want to. One other thing that is kind of handy is we can also align our handle. So suppose, for example, we had a polygon along his arm here that we actually wanted our pivot to be able to align up with so that we could rotate around it. One way we could do that is we could right click on our pivot on that little purple box that appears when we hover over the center. If I right click on that, you can say there's a bunch of different options you can choose from here. And there will be different options depending on whether you're using a camera handle or any other type of geometry. But for right now, we could say under this align handle menu, we could choose this orientation picking option. So I'm going to start orientation picking, and you can see that it gives us some options over here about that will allow us to help align our manipulator. But if I wanted to say, align to this edge right here, you can see that it sort of is snapping to points and edges and polyfaces. And if I just give it a click, it actually has moved the entire geometry into the position of that polygon, which isn't necessarily what I wanted. So I'm going to undo that. And I'm just going to hit the insert key because we're actually trying to manipulate the position of our pivot, not the actual geometry just yet. I'm going to do that again. I'm going to right click on that center square. I'm going to go to align handle, start orientation picking. I'll move back down to that edge that I was hoping for and click again. And our pivot and rotate has been updated to that edge right there. And then I'll just hit insert once again and pop back out here, and we are able to rotate around that edge. And we could even translate along, we could even translate along that edge as well if we wanted to. It looks like, yeah, when I did this earlier, I just clicked inside and it looked like it was just going to be translating around relative to my camera. You just want to make sure that that little X icon pops up, and when you get on that handle and you start dragging, and it will only drag along that axis if that's what you're after. So other things, suppose you get down here and you decide you actually just want to, keep the alignment over here, but you just want to snap to a different section of the geometry. We could turn on our pivot translate mode. I could hit the insert key, and then over here we've got our snapping options. So if I choose point snapping, I can just drag this over here and say snap it to, I don't know, a point in the middle of its eyeball. And so now our axes have been, our pivot has been snapped to that location. And if I were to hit the insert key again, I could hit this scale tool right here and increase the scale of this rubber toy with respect to that position on the eye. So yeah, the manipulator looks like it actually will cover the rotation and translation of your object, but then there are your classic sort of translation tool, rotation tool, and scaling tools on the left. And these work very similar to the previous tools, scaling, rotation, all pretty standard stuff. This tool right here is sort of the pose tool. I think that's mostly used in rigging or if you're doing any character work. I have not used it myself, but it's there just in case you need it. And other things, these are also other common things such as grid snapping, snapping to curves, and just snapping in general. So I'm going to turn off snapping. Here we've got our camera tool. If I click on that, this just gives us, we're just able to tumble around the viewport without holding down the Alt key. I would just prefer to hold the Alt key. And this down here is an interactive render region tool that should fire off a monitor render inside of this square. If I were to select it, you can see it's starting to do that right now, like so. I'm gonna get rid of that and hit this little close icon up there. Also, there is this inspect tool. If I was to, you know, kind of bring it up, it actually looks like it magnifies whatever the pixels are in my viewport in that section. So I'm gonna just let's see. I'm going to click back up to my selection tool. I'm going to turn this off. Then down here, we've got a flipbook tool. This is great for doing little flipbooks. Those would be similar to like hardware previews or play blasts, if depending on which terminology you use, but basically just an animation of what's in your viewport without actually rendering it. And then down here is another little shortcut for rendering. So another thing that we can do is once we got our geometry over here, we can also sort of freeze our transformation, which is called clean transform. So if I hit the clean transform, you can see that all of our translation, rotation, and scaling information disappears, and we still have our manipulator aligned the way we left it, but it is sort of a zeroed out area. If we wanted to, say, have animation that we were going to, like, you know, we wanted this to be our, like, sort of landing point for our animation or our starting point, we could freeze our transformations using this down here, this clean transform drop down from the modify pre-transform, and that would sort of give us, allow us to set what our home base is. If I wanted to extract that information, you just go back down here and say extract pre-transform, and it brings your information back. So that's sort of how to do some geometry positioning and manipulation on the object level. I'm just going to hop inside here on the SOPs level, and we'll talk about how we can do it inside there. So I'm going to jump in. And you can see we've got our geometry that is parametrically creating our test geometry. And in here we've got a translate, rotate, and uniform scaling abilities on the actual geometry itself. It's great that those are there, but a lot of times what you'll do is you'll throw down a few different nodes and be changing this geometry, and then you'll want to translate it later after the fact. So that's where something like the transform node comes in handy. So suppose we wanted to throw down a cube and then merge that with this. So I'm just going to throw down, let's hit the tab key and type cube. And you can see our cube appears. Our cube is actually appearing aligned to the transform that we supplied up here. This is one of the reasons why I actually prefer to do most of my transformation down in this SOPs level and not up on the object level with this, with all this stuff up here, because it kind of creates unexpected results. My cube is actually aligned to this object, and I really kind of want to, in general, it's easier for me to think about having things aligned to the world when I'm working in SOPs. So I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to control middle mouse click all of these fields so that it resets. And I'm going to reset the scale. Then I'm going to jump inside here, and you can see that my cube, when I create a new cube, is aligned to 0. If I were to throw down a sphere now, or maybe let's actually throw down something like a tube, you can see that the tube is also aligned to 0. So, for example, now if I wanted to translate some of this info, I'm going to merge these together, and so we've got all of this geometry showing all at once. I'm actually going to, let's see if I'll move the tube off to the left, and I'll move the cube off to the right. Again, I'm just middle mouse clicking and dragging to get this ladder function here. Again, I also have the manipulator available. I can move it using these handles if I wanted to. Click the tube. And the tube actually, it looks like it doesn't give me that type of movement, but if I select my movement handle over here, I can sort of adjust that as well. So suppose we've done this, and then I wanted to add maybe some noise to the rubber toy in the middle. We'll add a mountain, like we did in our previous example. I'm just going to throw a mountain down in there. We've got this nice gnarly looking rubber toy. I'm going to just bring the height down a little bit. But then suppose I wanted to rotate the rubber toy, but I wanted to leave that noise the same. Well, if I go back up here and I start rotating that rubber toy, you can actually see that down here in our merge, with our merge display, the rubber toy is sort of swimming through that noise. It's getting a little bit tighter. You can see the rubber toy is now swimming in that noise field. It is moving through the noise field that's affecting it. But, suppose I really like the fact that, the side of his head is dented in right here, and I kind of want to keep that. If I start translating, that dent is going to go away and get all warbly and be changing. So this is where having another transform node comes in handy. I can hop down below the mountain and then add a transform, and just kind of drag that into this wire here. Now, because it's happening after the mountain, we're able to transform using, let's grab the, I'm going to drag select over this, and you can see I've got a manipulator that shows up. And now if I rotate it, that noise has been kind of frozen onto the geometry because it's happening after the fact. So I can move this around and rotate it, and it is not being affected by the noise, or the noise effect is traveling along with that transformation, because everything that has happened leading into this node is already sort of baked at that point. So if I wanted to, say I want my rubber toy to be at an angle like this, I can merge it back with these guys, and then suppose I need all these to rotate 90 degrees. I can throw down another transform. Again, I'm just hitting the tab key to bring up my tab menu, typing in the first few letters of transform and hitting enter, and then set the display flag here. Now my unit, or my pivot, is still at world origin, and I can rotate it. So if I move this off to the side now and then throw down yet another transform, you can see that it by default puts the transform at 0, so that now I am rotating these things around 0. If I wanted to, I could similarly do what we did in the object level, which is hit the insert key, change the alignment of my pivot to be wherever I want it, and then hit the insert key again, and then I'm rotating about this axis. It might seem kind of silly at this point to have a node just for performing transforms, but you'll really find out that having a node representation of a transform, it's just a different way of looking at a hierarchical series of transformations, like nested nulls in C4D. If you have a null inside of a null inside of a null, and each one of those has a different sort of translation, that's essentially what we've done here, but it's just represented in a flowchart form rather than nested folders. As time goes on, even though this is a really simpler example, as time goes on, you'll find that having this level of explicit control over your transforms is super handy. Another cool node to talk about while we're down here at the SOPs level is the copy node. So I'm going to let's take our box over here. I'm going to grab, okay, so we've got our box. I'm going to just hold down the Y key and disconnect the box from the rest of our streams over here. And it looks like I accidentally hit Y while I had this field selected. I'm just going to right click and say delete channels. That just means it thought I was trying to write in an expression, and that's not what I was after. I was just trying to reset it and accidentally hit the wrong key. So I'm going to take this box, and another cool node is this copy node. So I'm going to throw down a copy, and this copy and transform node. So I hit tab and I typed in copy. You can see there's actually a few different options here. We're only going to be doing maybe the first couple of these for right now. But yeah, if I hit copy and transform, this this sort of acts as the beginnings of what a cloner would do. Right here you can see my total number of copies 2. If I crank that up, it's actually doing nothing. But this transform right here on the copy node is actually going to translate my geometry each iteration. So if I am going to translate this up in Y, you can see that all my copies start to appear in Y. And if I just crank up this number, it just keeps building more and more copies in that direction, translating each one by whatever value I have set here. And so I could, for example, make my box. I'm going to grab my box and, I've got my manipulator selected over here. It actually gives you these nice handles for dragging out the edges of your box. And so I've got my box being cloned vertically. I could also add just a little bit of Y rotation to them. And you can see that they start to do this little twisty thing, which is kind of cool. So copy node is super handy for translating and cloning. Very simple clones. You can get pretty deep with it too. Similar to like cloning onto a piece of geometry. If I throw down a grid, which you can see right here, and then I add a copy to points, I can actually, if you hover over this node, now this node has 2 inputs. If I hover over this first one, it's got a little red indicator saying that it's requiring primitives to copy. So the primitives that we want to copy are we want to copy these boxes. So I'm going to copy these boxes in here. And over here, this red input is saying required target points to copy to. Well, we want to copy that onto the grid. So I'm going to just wire the grid in here. And if I set the display flag to this copy to points, you can see that it has cloned our boxes to all those points on the grid. And I can go back here and change the height of my boxes and also, rotate them as well. And it will sort of update those clones on the grid. Other things that are sort of standard to wanting to get control over your objects is doing things like parenting. So I'm going to just delete what we have so far. I'm going to throw down some more test geometry. We'll go with, let's do the shader ball this time. So here I've got the shader ball. I'm going to hit spacebar F to sort of frame that up. And then I'm going to throw down, let's say, a cube. Or, sorry, it's not called a cube. In Houdini, it's called a box. So throw down a box. And I'm just going to transform the box down a little bit. And actually, let's just throw it underneath the shader ball. So it's almost like the shader ball is resting on top of this box. So if I wanted to parent the shader ball to the box, one might think that we could hop into the tree view and find this geometry and simply throw the shader ball underneath the box, but it doesn't actually work that way, which we discussed in the first section. But it's just not designed to operate this way. So I'm going to collapse the tree view back, and I'm going to go over here. Now, the way nodes flow into and out of nodes in here is they are looking for parents and output children relationship. So if I hover over this top input here, you can see it's looking for in the bottom of the network view down here. You can see that it's looking for a parent. So if I were to bring this over here and wire the box into the test geometry, you can see that it is taken the test geometry and moved its pivot to the center of this box. If I didn't want it to snap to the center of this box, what I could do is I'm just going to hold down Y and drag through here to disconnect. and it pops back into its position. If I grab this test geometry shader ball and go up here into its parameters and say keep position when parenting, then when I drag this box into its parent slot, it stays exactly where it was. Now what I can do is I can rotate this box, and the shader ball will rotate along with it. Another fancy way of organizing your scene is you could drop this stuff into a subnet. So suppose I've got, a bunch of nodes that I've worked on, and I kind of want to keep that setup sort of organized. Maybe I've got another null that I've thrown down, and I could use this null. Actually, I'm gonna disconnect this by dragging through it with Y. I'm gonna just move this null over here. Suppose this is where I want it. I'm working on a rig, and I want this to be the pivot of where I'm going to rotate this new setup around. If I take this box and I select keep position when parenting and drag this into its parent input, then I could, rotate about this null, and there we go. But suppose I want all these things to be sort of self-contained. I could put them into a net box. That's what this is up here. This will take the things that you have and put them into a subfolder. So now everything is contained in this subnet, and this subnet has its own transform. So if I'm rotating this subnet, you can see if I hop inside, it's got another object context in here with our objects and our geometry underneath, just where we'd normally create it. Looking at our tree view, that is sort of a similar setup. We've got our boxes, null, test geometry, etc. Now, likewise, I still can't drag things in and out of that subnet, but it's just good to know that they're there. So suppose I want to actually parent this folder of geometry to something else. Let's try this. So what I can do is, let's say I want to add a null out here at the third unit. I can throw down a null. I'm going to hit tab null. And this null, by the way, basically does absolutely nothing other than act as a placeholder in space for us at the object level. So I'm going to take this null, I'm going to translate it over to position 3 on the Z. So I'm going to hit tab over to this field, type in 3, and hit enter. And you can see our null is over here now. And if I drag this into one of the inputs, it should be good to go. But wait, if I try and rotate it, it actually is doing nothing to my geometry. What happened here? Well, if we dive inside the subnet, I'm going to just undo right now. If I dive, I'm going to set this back to 0. If I dive into the subnet, you can see it's actually created these inputs. These 4 inputs up here at the top of our subnetwork correspond to these 4 inputs on the top of this node. So if I wanted to parent this to this, I could just hop in here, grab my null, my top null, say keep position when parenting, knowing that I wired up here this null into the first input. Inside of this subnet, I can take this first input and wire it into the null. Then when I hop back up here, this null can now rotate the contents of my subnet. Before we move on, one other subtlety I just want to cover is the difference between a object level null and a SOPs level null, and object merging different geos between your objects, which is what SOPs level nulls are used for. So out here, our null exists as sort of a pivot, or used in creating parenting relationships. It's a lot similar to what you would get out of the functionality of a null in Cinema 4D or After Effects. But at SOPs level, we can use our nulls in a different way for project organization and just to make our lives easier. So I'm going to just select these guys and turn their display flag off. And for this example, I'm going to slide off to the side here, and I'm going to throw down a sphere, and I'm going to throw down a cube. Not a camera, a box. There we go. All right, so diving inside here, I've got our sphere. I'm going to select up here where it says primitive type, I'm going to choose polygon, and I'm going to just increase the frequency a little bit. And to kick it off, I'm going to throw down an RBD material fracture. And it's going to think for a second. And just going to wire this in here. set the display flag to the RBD material fracture, and I'm going to throw down an exploded view. So you can see we've broken apart our geometry here in a fashion that's very similar to like a Voronoi fracture. I'm just going to add a little bit more detail and take it a step further. And we're going to use a chunk of this to carve out a piece of our box that we're creating over here. So going back inside the sphere network, I'm going to grab our RBD material fracture. I'm going to add edge detail. Thanks for a second. And that's some, it's got some nice jagged edges, and I'm going to add some interior detail as well. So these are some nice chunks we've got going on here. Now, suppose I wanted to take just one of these chunks and move it over into the box network and use it to start like booleaning out chunks of it so that it was, you know, in a way of adding like damage or distress to the box. Well, I could grab my selection tool and I could try to start selecting my, with the exploded view select, I could try to start selecting geometry, but you can see it's just sort of selecting kind of the poly faces at this point. And really I want to actually select one of these pieces. Well, up here under this selection toolbar up top, which we'll get into a lot more detail later, I can select 3D connected geometry. And when I hover over these pieces now, you can see it's selecting the entire piece. So suppose I want this piece right here. I'm just going to click on that, and then I'm going to hit Tab and type out the word split. And what split has done is it has taken this incoming geometry of the exploded view, has gone into the split, and it's selecting this group that Houdini had determined because all of these primitives were connected. So it split our geometry into two separate sections. We can only see one activated, which is this left output on the split, but there's also a right output on a split that has the rest of our geometry. So in order to see that, I'm going to throw down a null. And this is what we were talking about. This is the SOPS null, designed to make your lives easier. So over here, this is the rest of the geometry without the piece that we took out. And here is that piece that we took out. So right here, I'm going to write out, and I usually like to write this in all caps because as you can see in the next step, it actually, we're going to use a list. We're going to pick this null out of a list, and having it in all caps pushes it up to the top of that list. So I'm going to call this, null the rest of the pieces. And then I'm just going to option drag this null over here and wire it to this first input and call this my piece. So these nulls literally do nothing. They have barely any features to them in their parameters view, and they're more or less just for acting as placeholder like bookmark type places. So if I go back out now and I go into our box, I'm going to just turn on hide other objects so we can just stay focused on our box here. Now, I want that piece that I had in my other network. What I can do in order to get that into here is to use a special node called object merge. So here, this node allows us to select something from another network, and this is where it makes it easy to select a null. So up here, we want our first object that we're going to select, that we're going to bring in. We can pick that using this button right here. I'm just going to click that, and this window pops open. And we can navigate to our sphere where we created our piece null, and we can see that we've got our piece here that we wrote my piece. So if I select that and hit accept, it brings that piece into our network here. So if I template the box and we have our piece right here, you can see that they're both kind of, we can now do operations on these two together. So like, for example, let's just bring up the scale of this box a little bit, and then I'm going to add a transform. And I'm just going to move this piece into position. I'm going to grab my manipulator here. Whoops. And I'm going to just hit the insert key and maybe snap the pivot to some location on the geo. That's good. I get the insert key again to go back into actual manipulator mode that moves things. And we're just going to, let's just bring this piece over here. I'm going to turn snapping off. It's starting to get a little jaggy there. And we'll just bring that right there. And then we'll just use the Boolean and bite chunk in the shape of this chunk out of this chunk. So let's do that. Let's throw down a Boolean. And in the first input, I'm going to wire in the box. And in here, I'm going to select, we're going to select subtract. So it's going to subtract A minus B, A being the first input, B being the second. I'm just going to wire that chunk in here and click the Boolean. You can see that it's taken the chunk out of it, but it's turned black. It's just something that happens sometimes. You can fix that by throwing down a normal. The normal just kind of makes sure everything's pointed in the right direction. So you can see here, we've pulled in our, I'm just going to dial this cusp angle back so we get some nice hard edges. We've pulled in our geo from this other network that we created back up over here. We've grabbed the geo that we want. We don't really need that anymore. We bring it into our cube geometry, and we're able to cut a chunk out of it. And you know, suppose we wanted to do this again, we could just grab another transform. I'm just going to option drag this transform over here, and I could grab this guy and let's see. Well, first let's just object merge these two together. I'm going to tab and not object merge, just regular merge. And so if I have these and I select both of these and drag them down, it actually automatically wires both of them together. So you can see both of our chunks together, and then I can actually add them to the Boolean. And when I bring that up, let's get the normal here. Let's grab our other chunk, and we can just start moving it around. Suppose we want to have another chunk down here on this side. So we can bring it in. You can see it's cutting into our geo there. You can bring it out. And just like any proper Boolean, it's got some sections that glitch out a little bit, but for the most part, you're able to kind of do your thing, and it's a pretty solid Boolean. I mean, I use this thing all the time. It'll come up a lot later on in the course, but I just wanted to kind of show you an example of how we can use the nulls and the object merge to organize our scene. So, you know, now when we're done with this section, usually I will put a null at the very end and say, you know, give it a name that makes sense, like my distressed cube. So if I'm ever in some other network where I need to reference my distressed cube, I know where to find it when I'm looking in my box object. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, well, you know, why wouldn't I just create the two objects originally in the same network? Well, there's going to be a lot of situations once you start making more complicated networks where it isn't really an option to build all of your geo in one network. You're going to have situations where you want to actually maybe, you know, use a branch of this and send it into a sim to use it for something entirely different, in which case you could put a null here and you've got your pre-fractured geometry that you can reference here. You know, it's the geometry that hasn't been exploded yet. You can say this is pieces put together. And you know, you'll wind up with networks like this where you've got lots of nodes and lots of changes along the way, and you need to reference certain points along that journey that you've taken to create your geometry and use them in other networks. And it just makes things really nice, really fluid, and really easy to organize using these placeholder null bookmarks. So I hope that was helpful. It's going to come into play a lot later on. If it doesn't make quite so much sense right now. Eventually it will. These are important concepts, certainly, but, you know, actually using them in practice with a really complicated project will help make things seem a little bit more clear as to why they are useful. So in that section, we basically covered the basics of moving things around in a very general way, nothing too complicated. And in the next section, we're going to be talking about setting keyframes and doing some animation.